Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with emotion researcher Dr. June Tangney. June earned her PhD in clinical psychology from UCLA and has been a professor in the psychology department at George Mason University since 1988. She is a recipient of the International Society for Self and Identity's Distinguished Lifetime Career Award and a fellow of the Association of Psychological Science and of the APA's Division of Personality and Social Psychology. June serves as an editor of the journal Self and Identity and has co-authored or co-edited several books, including Shame and Guilt, Shame in the Therapy Hour, and the Handbook of Self and Identity. Her primary research interest is the development and implications of moral emotions. Her current work focuses on moral emotions among incarcerated offenders. I sat down with June to discuss the negative emotions of shame and guilt. One of the main takeaways from my discussion with June was the importance of interpreting negative information about oneself as being bound to the situation, rather than a reflection of one's core self. The idea that doing something bad does not necessarily make you a bad person is a nice framework to understand the ideal way to process thoughts about ourselves when we don't live up to our own expectations. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's no such thing as bad people, but we need to be aware that human beings are complex creatures with diverse backgrounds and competing internal thoughts and motives. Even the most difficult people we encounter in our lives experience shame and guilt, perhaps more than the average person. Additionally, June's perspective was in line with a spotlight analogy I like to use when talking about attention and the self. If you picture our attention as a spotlight, many of us default to pointing the spotlight inward and behind, engaging in statements of self-criticism and ruminating about the past with the hopes of convincing ourselves not to repeat a certain behavior. You made a fool of yourself. You're not good at this skill. You should have known better. While a little bit of introspection is healthy, pointing the spotlight outward and forward is far more effective at generating new behavior. When you fall short of your own standards, asking, "What will I do the next time this happens?" When you feel you've disappointed someone, asking them, "What do you need from me in this specific situation?" Or if you unintentionally hurt someone's feelings, directly asking them, "What can I do to make things better?" These types of questions are great ways to leverage curiosity to behave more in line with your core values and to improve one's emotional intelligence. If you struggle with feelings of shame or guilt, this episode will give you some insights into how these negative emotions can be channeled to produce positive change. Enjoy. All right, today I am joined by June Tangney. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Well, that's good to hear. June has researched and written quite a bit about the topic of shame and guilt, amongst other topics related to emotions. Shame and guilt fall under this large umbrella that you might call negative emotions. Brené Brown fits shame and guilt under this category of places we go when we fall short of expectations. I'm curious to start, how do you think shame and guilt fit into the entire landscape or the family tree of negative emotions?
Mm-hmm. They're much they're much more complex emotions than what we think of as the basic emotions. So basic emotions include fear and anger, and then on the positive side, joy, uh, those kinds of emotions that we see very, very early in infancy and on the face unambiguously across cultures. Um, Shame and guilt and also embarrassment are what some people have termed secondary emotions, emotions that emerge later in life. And I'm not talking about late in life, but, after the first year, um, with embarrassment maybe popping up earliest around 15 months. And they require a sense of self because people also think of these as self-conscious emotions. So emotions where it's the self evaluating and judging the self. We feel shame about us. We feel guilt about things that we've done. We feel embarrassed about things that we've done or not done, or things that have happened to us. Um, we feel pride. Pride is another self-conscious emotion, but on the positive side, where the self evaluates the self. So you have to have a sense of self, first of all, which very young infants don't have, and also a set of standards. People also think about shame and guilt as negative emotions that fall into the category of moral emotions. And among the other moral emotions, people might include possibly pride, but also things like gratitude and awe, um, those sorts of sort of secondary emotions.
So if it's the case that you have to have an established sense of self in order to feel these what you would call complex emotions, does that mean that if some sort of circumstance about your childhood or your adolescence causes you to sort of not get a fully set or fully clear or distorted sense of self, that you might experience shame and guilt different from others?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I think probably yes, in the extreme. I mean, first, let me back up and say that these are, pretty universal emotions that people from all walks of life experience, most
Okay.
people, and different cultures, different points in history. Um, there does seem to be a very small percentage of the population that really is particularly unable or has difficulty experiencing guilt about behaviors, um, and also empathy towards other people. And I'm thinking about people that we would consider in the psychopathic range.
I see.
But for the most part, these are pretty much general emotions that people have access to.
So, from the general public standpoint, a lot of times these sort of complex emotions kind of blur together. We often use the words interchangeably without really doing a deep dive into the types of situations, the types of feelings you experience in these cases. One of the big distinctions seems to be the difference between shame and guilt. Could you talk about the difference between shame and guilt?
That was one of the first questions we had when we first started doing research on this topic way back, 30 some odd years ago was, is it really worth splitting hairs on the difference between shame and guilt? Because we often do talk about shame and guilt in, one breath, shame and guilt. I have problems with shame and guilt, or you should feel shame and guilt, or like that, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, I think the research is pretty clear that there is a difference. It's subtle and it's important. And it's not what most people think. So if you ask people just, you know, verbal, well-educated people, college students in particular, what's the difference between shame and guilt? They'll come up with all sorts of things, but there's a number one answer. And about a third of the people will say something along the lines of, we feel shame when other people know what we've done. We feel guilt when only we know. So kind of shame is more public, guilt is more private. And that also is consistent with some of the work mid-century, during the 1900s, in anthropology. I'm thinking of Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict in particular, who talked about that distinction. Nobody ever tested it out. Mm-hmm. And it's an easy thing to test out, actually. And so one of the early things that we did was we asked people, children, adults, college students, all sorts of people, to anonymously describe shame and guilt experiences, personal shame and guilt events. And we looked at, well, how public are they? Did they describe an event where other people knew what happened, it was public, or where nobody knew? And the surprising thing was, first of all, just how public they all were. Like, usually somebody knows when you lie, cheat, and steal. You know, if you lie, it's got to be a good one, right? Mm-hmm. Not to make light of that. The other thing that was just remarkable is that there was no difference between shame and guilt. 80% plus of guilt experiences that people described were public, and about 80% of shame experiences. And by the way, we also asked about embarrassment. 98%. People don't feel embarrassed by themselves, no matter what they're doing in their living room by themselves, apparently. So
that's probably a good thing, because we can all
yeah. So what is the difference between shame and guilt? And I was really very much influenced by the work of Helen Block Lewis, who did some really transformational writing in 1971 with a book called Shame and Guilt and Neurosis. In any event, her notion was, the difference between shame and guilt is not what you did or who's around, it's how you think about it, how you construe it. And whether you're thinking about, I failed or transgressed, I did this bad thing or whatever. And do I focus on the behavior, I did a bad thing? Or do I focus on me, myself as a whole? I'm a bad person for having done that. So really, is it just about a bad behavior, or is it a bad behavior that reflects a much more fundamentally flawed self? I did a bad thing this morning. I yelled at my kids. I'm a bad mother. As opposed to, I did a bad thing this morning. I yelled at my kids and I feel really bad about it. And I'd like to talk to them about that and apologize. One of the things that happens when people feel shame about the self is it's pretty selfish and self-focused and not much focused on the effects on other people. We want to hide when we feel like a bad person. We want to sink into the floor and disappear. We get defensive. We get angry and we blame other people and things and situations and try to get it off of us, because it's really hard to change a bad self. Like, that's a big ask, right? You're kind of between a rock and a hard place. Same event, same transgression. If I think of it as just focusing on the behavior and not some reflection on who I am as a person in general, well, a bad behavior is often doable. You can confess, apologize, and try to undo the harm. Really, really think hard about how you can avoid doing it in the future. It's fixable. It's much more fixable. And people who feel guilt about behaviors are not as overwhelmed, and they're much more future-oriented. Mm-hmm. and really about reparation.
I think about this a
Body.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. This, it's a theme in social psychology in general and how we think about ourselves, as it relates to self-esteem. When something happens, is it reflective of a pattern of behavior in ourselves or the situation?
Mhm.
I know personally, I feel very lucky because I feel like I'm very calibrated in the sense of being able to separate myself from my actions. If I did something wrong, I need to make amends with the other person. I generally I don't struggle with shame. Um, but I'm curious as to what are the factors that go into this process of as you go about your daily life, how do you pick whether something is a global evaluation or a situational one? Is it something that most people struggle with?
Um, you're asking how is it that some people end up feeling shame and other people end up feeling guilt, or neither?
I
Um,
think so, yeah.
Great question. So, what I have especially been interested in is the degree to which people are inclined to feel a lot of shame relative to their peers on a day-to-day basis. We call it shame proneness. And then also the degree to which people are inclined to feel guilt about specific behaviors on a day-to-day basis across, daily life. Um, it's not good to feel a lot of shame over the course of a regular day or a regular week. I think probably there are a few episodes, instances, over the course of a lifetime where it really, really, you should feel shame, right? But not like every day, every other hour. I mean, that's not good. Um, and so that's part of what we look at. And so the big question is, well, how do people end up becoming that way? Because it's pretty stable. Certainly, children have a moral emotional style by fifth grade. It can change somewhat over adolescence, but boy, the stability, across adulthood is remarkable. So if you are shame prone, you're likely to stay shame prone without some, thinking about it, or maybe therapy, or knowing about the difference between the two. And I speak as somebody who actually am a shame prone person. There's, this is some me search here. Um, and just knowing the difference is really helpful. Like if you can catch yourself feeling shame, 99% of the time, it's not fair. You really aren't a horrible person because you forgot somebody's birthday or a horrible friend. There's so many other ways that you're a good friend.
Hmm. And
Right.
it's also interesting, you mentioned children. My instincts are that as children are forming their identity, it seems like they're more likely to experience a comment globally versus situationally, like by default. If you scold a child for, talking when they shouldn't in class, or a parent, lectures a child on something they did at the dinner table, it seems as though they would immediately go, I'm a bad person. And I've done something wrong. I've disappointed my parents or my teachers. Do you agree that there is sort of a default and that you have to
I
kind of
do. I
build
am.
on to that in order to get to the level at which you're looking at situations?
um, yes, it's so interesting you should bring this up, and I'm partly curious whether you have children or not now. Because I look back, I before I had children, I had a pretty pat answer about how parents should give negative feedback to children. And it was, um, don't focus on the self, not Johnny, you're a bad person, but Johnny, you did a bad thing. Then I had children. and pretty quickly learned that a 3-year-old is not going to hear those differently.
Right.
And really trying to like shift a young kid from shame to guilt, really, to me, in retrospect, I think it's probably much more helpful um, just to work with young kids to focus on the behavior and help them get oriented towards coming up with a reparative plan. Okay, you broke this. You're okay. So you're sorry. And then let's see how we can fix this. Can we find another one? Can we get some glue and fix it? And so the idea of let's focus on repairing and moving on and not even try to make that distinction between self and behavior, because I think you're right. At 3 or 4, I mean, it's a pretty big distinction that maybe, well, Michael Lewis, also one of the trailblazers in shame and guilt research, he used to talk about people who are quote unquote guilt blind. They never feel guilt. They only feel shame. They just jump right from, I did a bad thing, to I'm a bad person.
Interesting.
And, how painful that is and unfair.
Now, if we assume that guilt is situationally focused, and how can I've done something wrong, how can I make that right? Shame is more self-focused. I am a bad person, or something in that realm. It seems as though guilt would be more functional when it comes to making amends, but is there an upside to shame as we understand it? Is there a benefit to feeling shame in terms of how it would impact our future behavior? Or is it the case of, if we're experiencing shame, that's always going to be self-focused, and it's only with guilt that we're going to see the behavioral change?
That is the big question. I don't know. I have looked and I have looked. I've spent, before COVID, a good 15, 20 years focusing particularly on people who cycle in and out of jails and prisons. And I wonder, and it never, I would love to take a year off and just like really sit down and talk in an open-ended way about shame and guilt experiences. I know I can think of 1 or 2 shame experiences in my own life where I did something and it was not, I mean, I could feel guilt about it, but it really was fundamentally what kind of person do you want to be moment. I think that might be possible, but boy, you have to like be willing to put aside a certain amount of and be at a moment where you're not defensive. There is another way. So I've mostly focused on the implications of feelings of shame and guilt for the person who is experiencing those emotions.
Mm-hmm.
How does it affect our mental health? How does it contribute or detract from our relationships? Does it lead us down a more moral or good path, good towards the good life kind of thing? Those kinds of things. And I read a paper, and I wish I could remember the name of the authors. I'm so embarrassed that I can't right now. But it was brilliant, and it just it changed the way I think about shame entirely after 35 years or 36 years. So the issue there was the third person. So if you shame me for having done something like, watering my lawn during
limited water order or something like
I'm
that.
thinking
Yeah.
about something in California, where we're really running out of water. I may not change. I'm probably not going to change my behavior. I'm going to probably get annoyed. I'm going to get defensive. I'm going to say, "Oh, what right do you have to tell me what to do with my lawn? You do what you want to do with your lawn, buddy." And for us to have that kind of exchange. But you've just shamed me, and if you shame me effectively, and there's a third person watching this,
Mm.
that third person is going to be less likely to water their lawn. So in a way, it doesn't change the person's behavior that you're shaming, but it does send signals socially out. People don't like being shamed. And so there is this kind of observational learning thing going on for
That's
effect.
super interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's
I
like
don't know why
so if
just never.
you're communicating a norm. So yeah, that's very interesting.
And in a powerful way that doesn't cause the person who's getting the message to, there's no defensiveness there. They're able to like sort of step back and say, yeah, well, maybe it's not a good idea also to water right now the lawn, and there might be other ways to whatever.
Yeah. Um, so I want to talk about guilt and shame, and which is a perfect segue, and social change. So the United States has gotten more individualistic over the last 50 years. This is something that Jean Twenge researches in detail. Um, and one of the consequences of that is that we are we're more accepting of individuals with minority traits. We're more accepting of different races. We're more accepting of people with different sexual orientations and a lot of other, we're a little bit less judgy than we were 50 years ago. And it seems as though people are probably less likely to experience shame for something that's just a part of their identity from a cultural standpoint. My question for you is, has the pendulum swung too far? So, for example, let's just take being late. It seems to
Oh, no.
me,
You need to bring that up. My own personal failing. Yes, go ahead.
we did not discuss this ahead of time. This is just I thought this was a perfect example.
Go for
So, it seems as though in 2024, people in general are less likely to experience guilt or shame from being late. And you're a little bit more likely to hear something along the lines of, well, I experience time a little bit differently, and my priorities are different. And or perhaps someone will bring up, I have ADHD. It's hard for me to keep track of everything. And, I'm sympathetic for those cases. But it does seem as though people are less likely to experience guilt and shame with being late, and perhaps other soft skills that you might encounter. So do you think that there is some sort of downside as we become more accepting of individuals? We may also become more accepting of behaviors that we shouldn't be accepting of, like being late or something like that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And the being late thing, is so culturally loaded. So cultures vary a lot in what it means to be on time. And subcultures vary a lot. Like, I'm in academia, and it's kind of a running joke about professors never getting their chapters in on time. 6 months is late is it's just kind of well, in any event. And as soon as you become an administrator, like, a chairperson, or a dean or something, all of a sudden they're all on time. And we're amazed, like they're just as busy or probably more busy than we are. We're all busy, but they especially. And they manage to be on time all the time. Um, so I think there are these subcultural and cultural differences. And maybe that is shifting here. I don't know, with these younger generations. But It does call to mind a broader way of thinking about maybe what you're trying to get at, not just lateness, but the degree to which there's more flexibility or less in how one behaves in a given situation, whether one's on time or not, whether one apologizes or not, or just waltzes in.
Or even the degree that they are focused on themselves versus others at its core. Um, I the other example that came to mind, because I think about guilt and shame as a potential tool. It is something that if it's present in a civilization, uh, it can enforce norms a little bit more effectively. So smoking, for example, cigarette smoking. I don't really know the research on why there's been a huge decline in cigarette smoking. I'm guessing it's not entirely due to just knowledge about the health effects. I'm guessing that part of it was the shift from it becoming a norm to be a smoker to uh, the norm that smoking is gross. I mean, I used to be a cigarette smoker, and
Oh, it
I,
was a huge change. It was a
yeah,
remarkable change. And when people say the media doesn't have an effect, I mean, just think of how uh, cigarettes were portrayed in dramas up to a
right.
certain point. It was elegant. Elegant people smoked cigarettes. The cool people smoked cigarettes. And then all of a sudden it became a marker of, oh, that must be the hidden murderer, or the whatever, and some kind of mystery or whatever, the bad guy,
Mhm.
or the one who's going to get knocked off first, or whatever. It did become much more stigmatized. And was that a good thing as a former smoker? I think so. I think I got shamed into quitting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was that I would say the same thing. It's very gradual and it sort of builds up over time. But going back to what I was asking about it, it seems as though um, societies can use, and I don't know if it's guilt or shame, but it seems as though societies can use this negative emotion collectively, and if that society gets a little bit too individualized, we lose that ability. I'm not sure if
Yes,
that's actually the
I
case, but
think it really comes down not so much to guilt or shame, even is the degree to which you talked about being tuned into the other person, and really the degree to which we empathize with other people as opposed to just focusing on the self. And I wonder so much about, I know very little about social media. I have to confess I'm a dinosaur, but my sense is that there's a lot of concern about how one portrays oneself and how one uh, then imagines how others view them so that's all me, and thinking about other people and how they view me, as opposed to me thinking about what would bring joy to this other person. What could I send, in whatever medium you're using, that would make them have a good day or whatever. So tuning into other people's feelings. And I don't know what, I know there's much more awareness of mental illness and um, uh, relationships, good relationships, bad relationship patterns. And I wonder if it's getting people to focus more on, with kindness, on other people, or more focused on the self. I just don't know. And
uh,
Jean Twin probably knows.
right.
He probably
That's
is
for another episode, right? Yeah. Um,
becoming less empathic, I think, is more the question. I think that I wanted to go back to the cultural differences in looseness versus tightness. They talk about loose cultures and tight cultures. Tight cultures, there is a way that one behaves, you know.
mhm.
in a restaurant. There is a way that one behaves at a funeral. There is a way that one dresses for this. It's very, very tight. And that tends to be in cultures where it's pretty heterogeneous. I'm sorry, homogeneous, where everybody is pretty much on the same page with the similar cultural background and like that. When you get to a country like ours, which is so diverse, well, there's a lot of different ways. And that's because we have a lot of different kinds of people. And is that a bad thing? I don't think so necessarily, as long as we're tuned into the needs of others.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that shame in particular takes on a different color in Eastern versus Western cultures. Western cultures, it seems to be related to self-worth, but in Eastern cultures, it's got more of a public reputation feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's something that these Eastern cultures and how they manifest shame, is there something that they get right, or do you just see it as one culture is different from another? There is no valence, better, worse, you know?
I don't think there's a better or worse. I think that cultures find their own ways of finding balance and how to balance the pluses and minuses of different emotions and different rules and like that. We have done some work on cultural differences in shame and guilt, and they were surprising results. So this was a study of children looking at 3 groups of children in the US, raised in the US, children in Japan, raised in Japan, and children in Korea, raised in Korea. They were all the equivalent of 5th and 6th graders, roughly. And we did find, as you might expect, cultural differences in shame proneness and guilt proneness. So Japanese children were higher on both, the highest on both. US children were the lowest on both. And Korean children were kind of intermediate. But what we were most interested in is like, well, what are the implications of being shame prone in Japan, especially? Is that it's not a great thing here to be more shame prone than the average person. You're more vulnerable to depression and anxiety. Not that you're going to necessarily have that, but it's a vulnerability. Would it be in Japan is pretty much what you're asking, and that's what we wondered. We had teachers' ratings of adjustment and aggressive behavior. And, people, both in Japan, children in Japan and the US and in Korea, who were more shame-prone than their peers, so relative to their country peers, had more problems. So you can be too shame prone any place.
And being shame prone, I'm interested in that. One thing that we haven't talked about is whether or not the guilt or shame that you're experiencing is correct. If it should be experienced, right? So some people experience guilt when if there were 10 people watching, they might say, well, that's not that person's fault, but internally they're feeling that guilt, or internally they're feeling that shame. What should we know about experiencing these emotions, and is it important at all whether or not are the outcomes different if the guilt is justified versus it's just sort of a personality trait that is causing you to experience that?
That is such a great question, and that is going to be left to the next generation to find out for sure. I mean, I can give you my really strongest guess. I don't know, because my measure, and it's a measure that many people use, focuses almost exclusively on events where you were responsible.
Right.
You did do something or fail to do something, right? And so what it doesn't have is scenarios that get at people feeling guilt for things that aren't their fault. And I would bet my house on the fact that that is not a useful thing. And I've given a lot of thought to how one might help people out of those kinds of unfair guilt experiences, unwarranted guilt experiences. But we don't have data much on it. Some people have done some work on that. Tamara Ferguson, I think, was poking around with that for a while.
Well, while we're talking about
And then this other group of people who are specifically interested in survivor guilt, which is a good example of, feeling guilty for something that it's just not your fault,
well, could you talk a little bit more about survivor guilt? I'm not too familiar with that idea.
Yeah, so the idea is that often people feel guilty for being lucky, for being the one who lived when, for no good reason, the one sitting next to them died. This comes from certainly the combat field, but also, real life, walking down the street in a car accident, all sorts of things. I think it was very much alive as an issue during the pandemic. Why me? Why did I survive? Or why, or
Yeah.
some of us actually were pretty lucky. We made out okay during the pandemic. It was not a pleasant time, but we had a situation and the luxury of not being out there every day dealing with the public and taking so do you feel guilty because you have something that somebody else doesn't have? And a lot of that depends on sort of your notion of whether life is a zero-sum game. There's only so much good to go around, and if you get some, that means less for somebody else. And I think mostly that's not true. Like, we could thrive and not take away from somebody else.
And it also reminds me of how this is tied into our self-esteem. This is, I'm thinking survivor. Why would you feel guilty for, surviving? It doesn't logically make sense, but when you look at how human beings kind of go back and forth between wanting to feel good and wanting to feel consistent with how we view ourselves, people that are depressed can sometimes get uncomfortable receiving compliments. It's very counterintuitive, but it seems as though, when you describe survivor guilt, that it does kind of speak to the different motives we have when maintaining our views of ourselves.
Yes. That's so interesting that you should say that. I think consistency and also wanting to believe that the world is fair, that fate is fair. And so if I survived and you didn't, for no good reason, something unfair happened, and
Yeah.
I must have, I took it away in a way, is what, it's not rational. Here's another good example of why we end up often tricking ourselves actually into feeling responsible for things that we're not responsible for. We can trick ourselves. I just realized this about a few months ago. Trick ourselves into feeling guilty for things that we're not responsible for. And it has to do with our natural tendency when something bad happens to engage in counterfactual thinking, to think about immediately, it's just hardwired in, I think, what could have happened differently so that this didn't happen? Let's say my crop just destroyed in one night, bad weather or something. What could I have done differently? This is the most horrible thing. Well, maybe I should have brought it in earlier, but how would I know? But, if only I had brought it in early, if only I had planted it a little early. I'm not a farmer, so I'm making things up.
Hmm.
If only I had, uh, gotten and really, really thought hard about rain beforehand or whatever. So we naturally do all these if onlys, and we're going to find some if onlys that sound almost like we're responsible, like, oh, a car accident that's really an accident. Here's a good one. If only I'd left home earlier. If only I
If
had taken a different route. If only this, all of a sudden, I'm responsible. I should have taken a different route. What? I couldn't have known, but I'm
right.
convincing myself that I am responsible in a really weird way.
So let's talk about coping with guilt and shame. What are some strategies that we can use to either reduce the discomfort or perhaps just something to channel these emotions to more positive outcomes?
Yes. I think, first of all, knowing the difference and uh, inquiring yourself, I'm uncomfortable and I feel bad. Is it shame or is it guilt? Let's say I decide, oh no, this is really guilt. It's not shame. Okay, are you responsible? Are you really, really, really responsible? Is this really your fault? Could you really have foreseen this? Did you really intend for this to happen? And if not, then can you be kind to yourself the way you would to a good friend and recognize that? And yeah, I think it comes back to sort of self-compassion in a way, stepping back and treating yourself the way you would anybody else that, you know. So doing some checking on that. Is it reasonable for me to feel guilt? Um, Other things. I think,
I've read a little bit uh, about simply talking about feelings of shame with close others.
over to the shame side. Oh, yes. If you can do that with a close other that you trust, that's huge because shame, Helen Black Lewis had talked about shame being kind of a pre-verbal emotion. We're hiding, we're not thinking it through. Our whole self is not engaged and working properly. We're under attack. You know, it's just, and defenses are all over the place and it's just a mess. So, um, to actually put into words and to say, I feel this, um, all of a sudden takes some of the power out of it. Some of the fear of the stuff I'm not really afraid, I'm afraid to look at. Now I'm going to put it out here. And to hear from another person, I still like you. I still am with you. I have not had this horrible negative reaction to you the way I have towards myself. Well, that is helpful, right? Right
Right.
there. Also, yeah, just you can start thinking about, is it really shame? Is it warranted shame, or it really was? Or are we talking about a behavior or set of behaviors that can be changed? If it's something about us, is it more, is it something that's worth really taking a good hard look at yourself every now and then? Maybe we should do that, but
Well,
not with a punitive look, but with a look towards, let's really think about our values and what we want to be.
yeah, and I really like what you said about guilt being very much forward thinking versus shame is more internal and sort of it's
Backward and
back and it's a loop, it's everything but moving forward. Um, Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a great discussion and a deep dive into some really cool emotions and some research that goes along with it. Thank you again, June Tangney.
Thank you so much.
For more on June, visit her George Mason University faculty page at psychology.gmu.edu. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/Why Do We Do That podcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That podcast, or Twitter at WDWDTpod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?